Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. There's been a lot of troubling news this week about COVID-19, particularly about the surging cases among the unvaccinated due to the Delta variant. Yasmin Abu-Taleb covers healthcare policy here at the Post, and she joins me now. Welcome to First Look.
Thanks for having me.
Actually, I think I should say welcome back. You've been here before. So let's talk
It's been a little while, but yeah.
COVID yeah, and the surging cases. How big a threat does the rise in cases pose right now?
It's a pretty big threat, and you can see both in their public statements and just in reporting that the administration is really worried about this. I think the thing that maybe not everyone understands is just how transmissible the Delta variant is. It's about 1.5, 1.8 times more transmissible than the variant of COVID we had circulating this time last year, when, of course, we didn't have vaccines or some of the treatments and countermeasures that we have now. But it is very serious. There's still a little over 30% of the country that has adults who haven't gotten a shot. Of course, kids under 12 still can't get vaccines. So there is a lot of, and you've seen cases climb at an alarming rate in the last 2 or 3 weeks. We were at 26,000 cases just about a week or two ago. Yesterday it was at 55,000 cases. So this is a pretty alarming rise.
In fact, the Post reported this week that the daily number of positive COVID cases has almost tripled in the past month, from about 12,000 to 35,000. Is the surge due to the Delta variant, or is it due to some other or additional reasons?
It is due to the Delta variant. That's what's driving it. The CDC director said earlier this week that the agency estimates 83% of cases are because of the Delta variant, but it's also because we still have such a large portion of the US population that hasn't gotten a vaccine. And the Biden administration has stressed this over and over. They've been calling this a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So more than 97% of people who are hospitalized for COVID right now are people who are unvaccinated. I think 99% of deaths, or more than 99% of deaths, are people who are unvaccinated. So it's those two factors that are a very sort of toxic brew right now in the country's pandemic response.
Can you talk about the debate that's going on within the Biden administration over mask mandates? Because you've got Los Angeles reimposing mask mandates. So is San Francisco. Yeah, the Bay Area has reimposed mask mandates. Are we heading towards a situation where the CDC or the Biden administration is going to say, you know what, put the masks back on as official policy?
It's hard to say. So the CDC had released guidelines back in May saying that if you were vaccinated, you didn't have to wear masks indoors or outdoors. And after that, you saw a lot of businesses relax their policies about indoor masking. You've seen it in the grocery stores and in various retail shops. And then, of course, most people don't wear them outside anymore. So I think the challenge here is that with the outbreak moving forward, it's not going to be the same as what we've seen in the last few waves of COVID. These are going to be pretty regional outbreaks based on places that have low vaccination rates. Right now, for instance, Florida is responsible for 1 in 5 new cases in the US, and that's a real hot spot because vaccination rates are pretty low in that state. It's like that in a lot of parts of the South and some parts of the West. So it's not going to be even across the country. So what makes sense for one state or one city might not make sense for another. So I think the Biden administration is mostly going to defer to states and localities to make these decisions. But my colleagues did report earlier this week that the CDC was evaluating data and determining whether it made sense to recommend masks indoors. But I think it is important to stress that it's not really up to the White House or to the administration. States and cities are going to have to make these decisions for themselves.
Well, you mentioned Florida, but what about Arkansas and Missouri? Any idea on how those states are responding to the rise in cases there and whether they're talking about mask mandates?
You don't see that discussion. And the challenging thing with those states is that they were not really enforcing mask mandates even last year before we had vaccinations and lower case rates overall. So, I mean, the challenge with these states with Republican governors who are extremely opposed to reinstating mandates. You saw the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, another state with fairly low vaccination rates, forbid schools from requiring masks, forbid businesses from requiring them. You, of course, see a lot of Republicans railing against the Biden administration's vaccination campaign. Some have started to change their tune on that a little bit, but there is this really stark divide in the country right now between the Biden White House and lots of Democratic governors and some Republicans who are really pushing vaccines, looking at mask mandates, whether they make sense. And then the other part of the country that wants to move on from this, has wanted to move on from this for a long time, and is pretty opposed to reinstating any kind of mandate.
In the little bit of time we have left, I have to ask you about the shift among some conservatives on the vaccine issue. This week, we saw House Minority Whip Steve Scalise get his first vaccine shot on Sunday, citing the threat posed by the Delta variant. Fox News host Sean Hannity is encouraging viewers to get vaccinated, although apparently yesterday he backtracked on that. But anyway, what do you make? How significant is this shift in tone?
It's not exactly an emphatic endorsement, in the way you described the Hannity backtracking. It is important because Fox News especially has millions and millions of viewers, and I think it's pretty clear that viewers really do listen to what hosts like Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson have to say. Of course, Carlson is still not recommending vaccines and even railing against Fox's decision to air an ad encouraging people to get vaccinated. But I think when you're talking about Steve Scalise and some Republicans talking a bit more about this, it's a couple of things. One is there is a lot of concern about the Delta variant and how hard it's going to hit Steve Scalise's state or other Republican House members who come from states with low vaccination rates, and what the next couple of months are going to look like for them. It is a lot of Republicans who are refusing to get the vaccine, which means that they are disproportionately going to be the ones who are hospitalized and dying from this. And of course, you saw the market start to turn this week on fears of the Delta variant. So I think it's a confluence of factors, but it's clear that this is not going anywhere. The Delta variant is a serious threat, and there's just no denying it based on how quickly cases have risen in just the last 3 weeks.
Yasmin, we are out of time, but I got to ask you this one last quick question because I think I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Your last name, Abu Taleb or Abu Taleb?
Abu Taleb.
I see. I knew I mispronounced it the first time. Yasmin Abu Taleb, thank you very much for coming back to First Look.
Thank you so much.
Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we'll find Washington Post columnists Eugene Robinson and George Will. Welcome back to First Look.
Glad to be with you.
Great to be here, Jonathan.
All right, let's start with the Select Committee on investigation on January 6th, the January 6th insurrection. Speaker Pelosi blocked 2 of the Republicans named by House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. So he pulled all of the Republicans from the committee and vowed to launch his own investigation. Eugene, I'm going to start with you on this. How did Speaker Pelosi handle this? And is there anything she could have done to have this bipartisan investigation be bipartisan, or was opting out of it the Republican plan all along?
Right. I think she's done all she can to make it bipartisan. I mean, let's back up for a minute. The original idea was to have a bipartisan outside commission of notables and luminaries, graybeards, to examine it and give us a full report. Kerner Commission or 9/11 Commission or whatever. That didn't happen. That was vetoed by Senate Republicans who wouldn't go along with it. So it's down to the House. It's down to Speaker Pelosi to do what investigation can be done, and so she decided to set up a select committee that I think was appropriate, and Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, decided to send a bunch of clowns as the Republican contingent on that committee, and Speaker Pelosi said no. She said no to 2 of the congressmen that McCarthy wanted to put on the committee. One was Jim Jordan, who is all hat and no cap.
I knew that's where you were going to go.
Yeah, I mean, he's a performance artist, and not a very good one, but not a person of substance at all, and Jim Banks from Indiana, who would have been the ranking member on the committee, who immediately on Monday put out a statement saying, "Well, we're going to investigate the readiness of the Capitol to face a riot," which is an appropriate thing to investigate. It shouldn't be the first thing. I think you first should investigate the terrorists and not the people who are trying to defend against it. But it's appropriate to look at whether the Capitol was ready. But he also said, and the response of the Biden administration. Well, there was no Biden administration on January 6th, as you well know. There wasn't a Biden administration until January 20th. So, he's another of these sort of Trumpist loudmouths. And so she said no. She said no. I'll pick the other Republicans, but no, these guys can't serve. And McCarthy said, okay, I'll pull the rest off the committee, which is, I think, he didn't want to participate all along, and so there we have it. And she had Liz Cheney on the committee, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. She's likely to add perhaps another Republican, maybe Adam Kinzinger. So she will have Republicans on the committee. They just won't be the Republicans that Kevin McCarthy wanted.
Mm-hmm. All right, George, I want your view. And specifically, do you think Leader McCarthy basically set this up by putting someone on like Jim Jordan on the select committee? I mean, you can't seriously say that he, really wants to be a credible partner on the select committee, meaning McCarthy, if he's putting Jim Jordan on the committee.
Well, I can't read his mind, so I don't want to speculate about his motives. However, there is in legislative affairs something called a poison pill. If you really want to defeat a larger bill, you add a particular measure that will drive people away from the bill. And it's perhaps Jim Jordan was the poison pill in this case. As Gene says, this is not like the 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, the commissions of that sort. In those cases, the country was attacked in some way, in some sense, by a brother. We were all together. There was no division of opinion about it. What we're experiencing here is that the very toxic political culture that produced January 6th in the first place now almost precludes a kind of investigation of it, which does not mean, by the way, there won't be investigations. There are all these FBI cases being brought in courts all over the country. Gene can correct me on this. I just assume there's a Woodward book in the works on this. So journalism and law are going to provide lots of investigations of this. I want to say one thing about, Gene raised the question about the secondary importance, which I agree it is secondary, of investigating the Capitol defenses and the Capitol Police response. It happens all the time in Washington that when an institution fails, it turns around and says, well, the reason we failed is we need more money. And the more money is then forthcoming. So already the Capitol Police has said we're going to open offices. Gene may remember the details, one in California, maybe two in California, to investigate what? The Capitol Police are now going to investigate the seeds of future attacks on the Capitol. Please, we have abundant law enforcement in this country. We don't need to reward them with new offices and new appropriations.
All right.
Let me agree with George on that. By the way, the Capitol Police have their own issues to deal with here in Washington, and it's the most unaccountable of Washington's umpteen police forces, and so I'd like to take a look at the Capitol Police. But again, that's secondary to taking a look at the people who actually invaded the Capitol. But he's right; they don't need an office in California.
Okay, so in terms of looking at the people who actually invaded the Capitol, one of the things that Leader McCarthy said after pulling all of the Republicans on the Select Committee, he said, you know what? We're going to do our own investigation, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. George, how credible would a McCarthy-led, Republican-only led investigation into the January 6th insurrection be?
It wouldn't be credible at all. And by the way, this is a complicated business, investigating. It's not something you do out of your hat. These are not trained investigators. These are supposedly legislators. We'll leave that designation aside for a moment. So this is spiraling down into yet another example of dysfunctional institutions, and the country will look at it and say, what else is new?
All right, so let's move on to infrastructure, since I'm riffing off your conversation a minute ago, George, about the Capitol Police and money. And one of the issues now in the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, is haggling over money. Last I saw, over transit versus highway funding. Just, I don't know if you know the details and the ins and outs of what that's all about in this current package, but what do you think overall of where we are right now in terms of a bipartisan agreement on the infrastructure package actually getting done? It was supposed to be done this week. Now we're saying it could be done. A vote could happen, a procedural vote could happen on Monday with all the details in place. Your view?
Well, first, it would be nice to have a bipartisan agreement on what the word infrastructure means. Is it infrastructure the way the common sense talks about it, what we used to call internal improvements, bridges, highways, airports, harbors, stuff like that? Or is it human infrastructure, which means everything else under God's under the eye of eternity, including school lunches? Or does it mean cultural infrastructure, a phrase coined now by those who want to revive the Federal Writers Project of the 1930s, to put out-of-work writers back to work? Although why a writer needs a subsidy to write, I don't get. But anyway, so first of all, it'd be nice to have a definition of this. Second, they're arguing about how to pay for it. Now, that's quaint in itself. We don't pay for things that the government does. We borrow the money for it. I mean, everyone's agreed on that almost everything that is being done will not be paid for by either taxes now or by cuts in spending elsewhere. It'll be paid for primarily by borrowing.
Gene, I mean, this is a good thing. George's point, we don't pay for anything, we borrow the money, and yet one of the big issues, one of the big hangups on this particular bill was the argument between the Democrats and Republicans over how to pay for this, in particular Republicans objecting to the IRS enforcement mechanism that Democrats were pushing as a way of helping to finance this bill. So your view on the financing of this nearly $1 trillion infrastructure bipartisan package?
My view is that it's largely semantic, the argument. George is right. We don't actually pay for things, we borrow the money. And you can argue about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There's a whole, there are very, very eminent economists who argue that that's a very good thing, especially if you're the United States and you're the world's reserve currency, and you need at a moment like this, above all when we're coming out of the pandemic or trying to come out of the pandemic, and you need to keep putting money into the economy, that it's a good thing and not at all harmful to borrow money. I'm not an economist, though I sometimes play one on television, but I won't venture to say whether that's right or wrong, but it is a kind of angels on the head of a pin in terms of arguing about the pay-fors, as they call it, because everyone agrees, in everybody, at least in the bipartisan group that's doing the hard infrastructure bill, everyone agrees that they're going to use dynamic scoring to decide whether it's paid for and how much it really costs and whatever. And dynamic scoring basically involves assuming that the spending is going to be so good for the economy that it's going to bring in more money. And you can make whatever kind of assumptions you want. And so it's a question about, what figures get written down as opposed to where actual dollar bills come from. And that seems to me something that they ought to be able to work out.
Gene, you were
Yeah.
mentioning, oh, sorry, George, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, you want bipartisanship. Be careful what you wish for. For years, Democrats have doubled over with laughter until their ribs ached when Republicans would say our tax cuts will, under dynamic scoring, pay for themselves. And they almost always exaggerated the beneficent effects of their tax cuts. Now the Democrats are saying our spending will pay for itself. Trust me, better school lunches will make, more nutritious breakfasts for workers and all the rest. And it's all fanciful. The latest one is a wildly extravagant estimate of how much more they will get from the Internal Revenue Service if they spend more money on the Internal Revenue Service in collecting uncollected taxes. So, as I say, you want bipartisanship, this is what it looks like.
but George, spending a bunch of money has always been kind of a thing that both parties could agree on. That's why it's such a it's a surprise actually that's taken them so long to agree to spend a whole bunch of money on infrastructure. That's the dysfunction. That's always been kind of popular, going back to the days of earmarks and everything.
There's no question when you tell the American people, hey, go to your mailboxes, you're going to find a check for $1,200, whatever it is. That polls really well, free money. But the interesting thing to me about Mr. Biden is this. He said this week, the American people want the investments. No one says the word spending anymore, the investments that he in his program. But they don't want it enough that he is going to ask them to pay for it, because as a candidate and again as president, his going in position is no one making less than $400,000, that is 98% of the country, is going to be exempt from any additional expense in their tax bill for what the government is doing. So if you're really confident that the American people want all these investments, wouldn't you say that they ought to be willing to pay something for it?
And that is part of the debate ongoing that we're just going to have to leave there. But George, can't end this discussion without talking about baseball. Not that I'm a baseball fan, but you are perhaps the nation's biggest and most preeminent baseball fan. And you wrote about the national pastime, quote, "The quality of the game as entertainment is declining. What's the problem and how do you want to fix it?"
The problem is that everyone, players, managers, pitchers, position players, everyone is behaving reasonably on the basis of abundant, accurate information. That is, we now can measure spin rates of pitches with new technology. We can measure the tendencies of hitters on certain kinds of pitchers. We know what launch angle will do as batters try to hit the ball over the new defensive shifts that the data put in place. The result is longer games and less action. Take the most watched game of last year, the sixth and final game of the World Series. The ball was put in play once every 6.5 minutes. In the last 26 minutes of the game, the ball was put in play twice. In April of this season, there were 1,100 more strikeouts than hits. Now, no one really is entertained by watching a guy walk to the plate, swing for a while, and then walk back to the dugouts. Not exciting.
Yeah.
So baseball is trying to figure out various rules changes, banning shifts, getting the sticky stuff off the pitcher's hands because that increased the spin rate, which makes the ball harder to hit. Various ways to increase the action, because young people particularly, whose brains have been wired by their digital devices, are not to say no more, patient about the dilatory pace of what once was our national pastime.
All right, you talked about
Yeah.
strikeouts and your problem with strikeouts, but you also have a problem that you say there are too many home runs. Don't fans love home runs?
People love caviar, but if you had caviar 3 times a day, you'd have had enough of it. Mae West Coast, too much of a good thing is wonderful. But she was thinking of sex. That's different. The fact is that home runs can be boring. Home runs are 3 seconds of excitement as the ball flies out of the ballpark, followed by a leisurely jog 360 feet. No. What you want to see are the great athletes, and they've never been more athletic, the major league players, with fielding the ball and throwing the ball and doing things like that. Major league players spend much more time with leather on their hands than with wood in their hands. Put the ball in play and let's see how wonderful they are at catching it.
Let me just throw in just two rule changes that I would certainly support. One would be, I think the shift ought to be illegal. The shift is, it's like an abomination. There's something wrong with the infield shift, and they shouldn't be allowed to do that. And then batters should not be allowed to between every pitch step away and rejigger their batting gloves. They all do that, and it is annoying and it takes time. And why are they allowed to waste that much time?
Yes, all you is
real fast,
enforcement
George.
and the rule exists that you have to stay in the batter's box unless you perhaps swung and fouled a pitch off. Just make people stay in the batter's box, which was routine until fairly recently.
The last 4 minutes of this conversation is like sitting through an Italian lesson. I'm going to need a lot of translation. Eugene Robinson and George Will, we are out of time. As always, thank you for coming to First Look.
Ciao.
Ciao, arrivederci. And I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look. Go to washington.com, washingtonpostlive.com to register and find more information about all of our upcoming programs.